Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audience joining us from around the globe. And we welcome you to our webinar today on carbon pricing and development, co-benefits, growth, and jobs. The world today faces two major global concerns. One at a socio-economic level, with the dearth in provision or access to energy, clean and safe drinking water, sanitation, education. Well, that's on one side. On the other side, it's the looming threat of climate change, and we all witness the hard-earned reality of its impacts. Now, with the Sustainable Development Goal 13 that stresses on climate action, can carbon pricing address these both issues simultaneously? Does carbon pricing have a solution to the socio-economic concerns on one end and the environmental concerns on the other end? And what does this mean to the African subcontinent? To answer that and more, we have a team of esteemed panelists joining here with us. We have Mandy Ramboros, Head of Climate Change and Sustainable Development from ESCOM. We'll be soon joined by Kolissa Ngwadla, Business Development and Commercialization Executive from the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. But before we start, a few housekeeping rules. The first 40 to 45 minutes we would be devoting to the presentations, and the following 10 minutes would be open for question and answer round, where you as the participants and audience can type in your questions, comments, a discussion that you would like to initiate in your chat box. Secondly, in case you face any technical issues that you're not able to hear the audio pretty well or the video that you can't see, feel free to again type in the chat box. So the chat box is the mode of communication between us. And now, without any further ado, we move to our presentation and our lead speaker, Mandy Ramboros. Mandy, over to you.
Okay, so shall I just start from the first slide? I think then you may have to change the slides for me.
Yes, please.
But let's just see how it goes.
No problem.
Okay, so then what I was saying was that from a South African perspective and generally from an African continent perspective, there is a clear link between development and sustainable development and carbon pricing. So while historically we haven't been talking about carbon pricing in the whole context of development, it has become more and more important for us. So what I was saying was that this first slide, which talks to sustainable development, is not something I need to explain, I'm sure, to people on the call, as we see this description of sustainable development pretty often. So in terms of what we see is that we need to have a balance of all of these issues, and that carbon pricing has a definite link to all of them, but it's not easy, which is why I have the whole thing around warning challenges ahead. So I think if you go on to the next slide, in terms of the context and from a South African perspective, what we say is that there is a need for socioeconomic transformation in the global context, and using the trends in climate change as lead indicators for what is to come. If we look at that, if we look at the world moving away from fossil fuels, if we look at the world moving towards more to less carbon intensive products and services, that for us in South Africa for the next 20 years to change what we produce and consume, or South Africa will no longer be part of the global economy. And I know that's quite a drastic statement to make, but if you go to the next slide, what we show in the next slide is the commodities that contribute to our balance of trade that are extremely vulnerable to global climate change. So if you know the South African economy, you would know that we are quite mining intensive economy, and that our electricity is produced mostly from coal. So if you look at all of the bars in blue and green, I hope it's showing up as blue and green on your side. If you look at all of those bars, it shows what we are vulnerable in terms of what we make our money from. So to explain the slide, the blue and green bars are those things that we make our money from as South Africa, and the red bars is what we pay for. So what goes out of our economy. And if you look at the green and blue bars, It's things like the precious metals, coal, iron ore, gold, ferroalloys. So it's a lot of mining industry. Towards the end there you see wine and you see electrical energy. So all of these sectors are impacted by changes to the global economy around moving away from fossil fuels and responding to climate change. And if you look at the things that we're paying for, it's petroleum oils, it's commodities not elsewhere specified like food, agriculture, those kind of things. So if we don't change our economy, which is why I made that drastic statement in the previous slide, if we don't change our economy and change the way we do things, we are very, very vulnerable to the changes in climate change. So, or the changes to the economy from climate change. So if we look at carbon pricing, then we do look at it from this holistic perspective to say carbon pricing is not a competitor to development. It is absolutely important for our development, given the dependence of our sectors on what is happening globally. So if you move on to the next slide, and I think for those of you who've heard me speak on this topic before, I say this over and over again, that carbon markets then are not only linked to mitigations and emissions reductions, but that we can price carbon to drive reductions. Yes, we can price carbon to drive reductions, but also for sustainable development benefits. So the developmental benefits is not just a co-benefit, but that we could actually have a broader narrative that says we price carbon for sustainable development itself. So I spoke in the previous slide about the challenges facing South Africa, but there are challenges facing Africa in general around energy access to clean water, sanitation, adapting our agricultural processes and sectors to the changing climate, and then this holistic approach is very crucial. So then we see this carbon pricing as a tool to support how we transition away from our coal-dominated societies. And what we look at is in terms of, if we're transitioning away, how do we price carbon so that we support development? And how do we price carbon so that we support social impacts of this development and of transitioning? And studies show, even through CPLC and through the World Bank, that this is one of the most effective uses of carbon revenues, is to price, is to use carbon revenues to alleviate social impacts. So if you look at it holistically, it's like we are saying, how do we price carbon to support development, and then also use the revenues from carbon pricing to support social development? So if I can use an example quickly, if we look at one of the things we're looking at in the country is the building of what we call microgrid plants. So microgrid plants are small electricity generating plants, usually solar, linked to batteries, which you would place in rural areas or in rural communities. So they're not very big plants. And if you can get carbon pricing right, you could use a carbon market instrument to support the development of that plant, generate carbon credits. You have clean energy, but you're also developing that community. A community that previously did not have electricity could now have electricity. And because it's a small plant, and because it's not a small plant, is easier to manage and not generally impacted by changes in the actual climate, you're also then building in resilience and adaptation in that community. So there's various ways you can look at in terms of how do you link carbon pricing with development, with social transition, and with making sure we have clean energy. So there's a number of ways of looking at carbon pricing as a tool, and not just merely let's just shut down coal plants and that way reduce emissions. Of course, that is one of the other examples, but that is one of the other examples you can use in terms of linking the two. So we also consider carbon pricing as a tool for enabling repurposing of sites and assets, instead of allowing them to become stranded. And we are still looking at innovative solutions through these instruments. But for example, if we have, like I say, if we have these coal plants that we have in the country, and there's quite a number of them, and they occupy a large piece of land, they employ a lot of people, and we are looking at shutting them down, obviously, because of the changes in emissions profiles, in what the pressure is in terms of our country. But if we look at carbon financing for repurposing, so for example, if you can get an investor that would invest in a wind farm on that same site, then you can then price that product so that you attract investment and that you also repurpose the site. So of course, in an ideal world, we'd be able to re-employ everybody, but we won't be. But you would still be contributing to social development in keeping the community running. So we're looking for more innovative ideas around that and how you use carbon pricing as a tool for enabling repurposing. We do not want to end up with all the stranded assets because it will impede on our development. And then just the last slide in terms of the holistic approach. So it's, again, transitioning away from coal. What is the phasing and timing of that? What are the socioeconomic considerations and the cost? And then what are, in making sure we don't have stranded assets. Of course, I'm not idealistic. I do know that we may end up with stranded assets, but this is one way of looking at how do we minimize that impact. So it would be remiss of me not to mention Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which talks to carbon market instruments. So when I say carbon pricing and carbon financing, I generally mean the broader toolbox, in carbon taxes, regulations, climate financing, which Kalisa will speak to more when he gets onto the call, in terms of what is in that toolbox. But in terms of what is the Paris Agreement is offering, which is the Article 6 mechanism, it could address some of these issues. It is not a panacea. We can't use Article 6 to say it's going to resolve everything. But if you look at what it offers, is it does offer the opportunities to do cooperation between countries through the carbon market so that you can have the costs of technologies being reduced. We can have a regional approach. I think one of the main things about Article 6 is it's no longer carbon market instruments only on developed versus developing countries, but you could have cooperation between countries in Southern Africa. So South Africa could do a cooperative approach with Swaziland. It also allows us to enable some private sector financing. So if we do have financing through Article 6 mechanism in a project, we could look at blended financing from the private sector as well. So there is, at the moment, Article 6 is not agreed in the Paris Agreement. There's quite a few difficult things to resolve in terms of how do we account for it. So if South Africa does a carbon market deal with Swaziland, who gets the credits? How do we account for it? How do we report on it? Whose NDC does it contribute to? So all of those things need to be sorted out, but that's besides the point for this call. I think just to make the point that it's not agreed yet, it's something we need to get to. But just to say overall that we do not see carbon pricing, carbon financing as separate from development, or in previous years, in previous discussions, we've heard it said that carbon pricing can hinder development. But I think it needs to be seen as an instrument, as a tool that will aid and enable development, especially in this new world where countries are moving away from fossil products, where our exports are under threat, where we can do cooperation between developing countries in this respect. So I think there's a number of opportunities that we get from matching carbon pricing with development. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can just have a bit more robust discussion and questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Mandy, for that insightful. It was great to know that the example that you mentioned about the microgrid plants and the rural community and how it bolsters both the socioeconomic and yet the environmental impact. And now we move on to our next speaker for the session. We have Kolissa, who has just joined us, and he would be taking us through carbon pricing considerations for African continent. Is there an echo? Through African considerations, the main topics that he would cover would be carbon pricing instruments, the structure of African economies, and the choice of instruments. With that, Kolissa, it's over to you. Thank you, Kolissa, for that insightful presentation.
Thank you.
And now the next session, in the next segment, we want to question.
This will be quite brief, focusing primarily on the various instruments that are available, particularly to governments in respect of carbon pricing. And secondly, I'll just further look at characteristics of African economies and some considerations that policymakers might want to consider on how to choose the most appropriate instrument for their situation. So these are the three main topics that I will cover in this short presentation. So I think it's important, though, to present a context of carbon pricing in global climate action. The slide that you see is a message by the UN Secretary General for the September Climate Summit, in what the call was to all countries who were attending the summit, and what the expectation is in what countries should communicate as their updated nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC next year. The transition of 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade is quite a steep ask, and achieving net zero emissions by 2050 also requires unprecedented interventions in order to reduce emissions. And carbon pricing indeed has a significant role to play in addressing or contributing to the transition. So one of the key considerations, of course, is that climate action is not just about mitigation, and in that this deep transition, this deep cut in emissions and the response to climate impacts should not lead to inequality or a situation where there are global winners and losers in that instance. I think it's quite an appropriate opening context that one could present in terms of what role could carbon pricing play, especially in this case for African countries. With regards to instruments, I think maybe starting with the obvious is what carbon pricing is. I think simply put, is just putting a price on carbon. And the reason why there are various instruments available is because how you put a price on carbon can take various forms. It could be from an incentive perspective, or it could be from what can be termed a punitive perspective. But there are many interventions, of which I'm going to make a few examples of how a price of carbon can be decided on by a government. And then I just also wanted to introduce the concept of the social cost of carbon. I think as much as there's a lot of disagreement as well as technical complications in how to quantify the social cost of carbon, I understand the environmental protection agents of the US generally use a policy planning cost of about $40 per ton of CO2. However, if you look at the picture across the globe, you would find that a lot of African countries, for example, they would have a social cost of around $1 to $10 per ton. Whereas if you look at a country like India, you are looking at about $50 to $100 per ton. So it does vary based on the both the structure of emissions within that economy, as well as the associated climate impacts that such an economy is exposed to. You will see there's quite a few countries further up in the northern hemisphere that don't have a negative cost of social cost of carbon, rather a benefit from opening up of other economic opportunities as a result of warming. But the bulk of the world will actually be paying a price for carbon that is emitted. And a third point that I thought I should just raise is on, it's important that appropriate instruments are informed by circumstances of specific countries. And if you look on the diagram on the right there, I basically just divided the forms of how you price carbon into two. The first being market pricing, which is pricing forms where you define the outcome or reductions in CO2, but not the price at which such a reduction will be achieved. That is optimized through market mechanisms. Whereas with regulatory pricing, you define the price and what the outcome will be actually depends on the activity that has been that is being embarked on. And there are various instruments. If I was to start with the regulatory pricing, there is economy-wide tools, and the most prevalent one is a carbon tax. In most instances, it is advisable that states use their social cost of carbon as a proxy on where to set the tax. Whereas there are some which are sector specific. If you look at the forestry sector, there are examples of result-based carbon financing, which puts a price on carbon based on forest activities that one undertakes. You can also have levies. Okay, if you look, for example, at your liquid fuels for the transport sector, it could be that a levy on the fuel is an instrument that is more appropriate for that specific sector. Whereas you can also get incentives that are sector-based. And in South Africa, I can use the example of your power purchase agreements, where you guarantee a price of renewable energy purchases at a certain price that is competitive vis-a-vis fossil fuels. So the differential between the fossil fuel price at which you buy as well as the renewable energy effectively becomes a negative price on the fossil fuel cost or pricing. So in that instance, it is an appropriate instrument for carbon pricing. On the market side, Mandy spoke about Article 6, which are your international mechanisms. You do get international trading mechanisms, which, again, in this instance, the outcome is defined in terms of an activity and reduction in emissions, but the price is determined by the market. And going forward, I think how the negotiations on Article 6 evolve will determine how the global system works in that regard. And then you also get domestic mechanisms, like your offset mechanisms, your emission trading schemes. I think Europe has been a trailblazer in this instance, even though you get a few other countries as well as states like California and Quebec in Canada who have their own emission trading systems. Those also put a price on carbon. And it's just important to also note that in terms of the Article 6 discussions at this stage, there is also consideration of how can these various domestic systems be recognized in the international stage. Now, going to the second topic of discussion is the structure of African economies. I think if one talks of carbon pricing, especially in the African continent, it's important to have a very good sense of what sort of economies do we have. It's quite obvious that we've got mainly primary industry dependent economies, primarily minerals and agriculture, and a lot of African economies are undiversified as well, dependent primarily on a single commodity, whether it's a mineral, oil, cocoa, or whatever commodity it is that one is talking about. And in a lot of instances, again, it's fairly small economies with a limited number of players. It's counterintuitive when one understands the big component of the informal market in Africa, which is quite inclusive and has a lot of people participating in it. But when it comes to your secondary and manufacturing sectors, you always find that there's quite a limited number of players. And another key characteristic is the fact that energy is primarily a state function. Now, if you look at various economies, I've just put out some examples of emission profiles of South Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, as well as Senegal. There are quite some striking differences in these economies because the greenhouse gas emission profiles are an indicator of the economic structure. And if one looks at South Africa, for example, you've got a very high component of your emissions coming from the energy sector, which is primarily liquid fuels as well as electricity generation. And if you look at agriculture, it's the next biggest contributor, and then the rest are fairly are fairly small relative to the energy sector, which is indicative of an economy that has a more diverse economic structure, particularly in respect to manufacturing. However, the same cannot be said for Ethiopia, for example, where the biggest component of emissions is from agriculture. So again, you might want to understand, why am I looking at greenhouse gas emission profiles? Is because the different sectors or the different contributors to emissions profiles of countries require different types of instruments, or there are more appropriate types of instruments that are appropriate for those. And in my next slide, I will actually try to show the steps that a country can take in deciding on which instruments, carbon pricing instruments, are more appropriate for them. And if you look at Sudan, for example, there's a clear evidence of the dependence on both agriculture and a significant contribution from energy, but this is primarily emissions from oil production with all your fugitive emissions. And you look at Senegal as well, a big component on energy, however, agriculture still dominates. So if one was to compare these sources of emissions with a lot of developed countries, you'd find a very different picture in terms of the relative contribution of different sectors to the country's emission profiles. And this now takes us to the last part of my brief intervention. In terms of what processes could a decision maker in Africa take in order to arrive at an appropriate carbon pricing instrument. I think the starting point is political will. Okay? If there's political will for carbon pricing instruments, then there is something to start working on. If not, okay, your decision-making process simply ends there. But the first thing that I believe is important to look at is the economic structure and diversity. Okay, I spoke to that in using greenhouse gas inventory profiles as a proxy of how economies are structured, as well as the size that you have. Because if you basically have a smaller economy and with less diversity, the transaction costs of having a market-based instrument, for example, becomes a bit problematic, because of the fewer players that you have, as such the number of projects that have to be able to offset costs of institutional infrastructure to oversee such a carbon pricing scheme. The next stage, assuming again you are a small to medium African economy, will be to look at the types of sectors that dominate your economy. If it's your agriculture, forestry, and land use, there's the possibilities that become rational in such instances are those that look at regulatory pricing, such as your result-based schemes, as well as participation in international schemes, because the participation in international schemes has a little bit of lower transaction costs due to the global nature of how the common international infrastructure is generally paid by all those participating in that economy. But if you're a small economy, a few installations or plants that are emitting in both the energy and the industrial process sector, again, one can consider your regulatory pricing mechanisms, such as your carbon taxes, as well as participation in international schemes for carbon pricing. On the other side, if you've got a medium to large economy, the options start opening up a bit. And again, if your dominant emissions are in the Afolu sector, it's the same thinking that one will have in terms of following more of a regulatory pricing scheme or incentives. Whereas if more of your emissions are from energy as well as IPP, you've got several options. You can go the regulatory pricing route or market pricing. I think the biggest consideration now becomes, are you talking about a streamlined industry or a diffuse industry? I mean, if you look at a streamlined industry, could be emissions in the transport sector, okay? The process, the value chain of emissions from vehicles is a very streamlined process. As such, it's more cost effective to instill your pricing mechanism at the source of fuel because you do cover the entire sector. However, if you are dealing with a diffuse industry or a diffuse sector, such as manufacturing, you can have multiple installations that you have. Now, the next criteria that one could look at will be on the number of players. If you've got a low number of players, it could make sense to go for regulatory pricing. Of course, this does not exclude your international mechanisms for carbon trading. And this is, this is an example of a country like South Africa, because as diverse as the economy may be, about 70% of emissions from South Africa are from less than, let's say, 25 installations owned by less than 10 companies. So if you create a market-based pricing, the costs of administering such a system become too high for the size of or the pool that you would be targeting. I guess it's for that reason that the government of South Africa opted to go for a carbon tax. Whereas if in your economy you've got a high number of players, then you do have a significant opportunity for looking at market-based pricing mechanisms. So with those slides, I just hope I did manage to just briefly give a picture of not only the available instruments, but also some considerations that African countries could take in taking forward carbon pricing and contributing their fair share to achieving the 45% reductions by 2030, as well as net zero emissions by 2050. So thank you, Chani.
So here we have a question, how to recognize that a national economy is ready for the market? I guess the question is aimed to Kolissa. Mandy, please feel free to chime in.
Okay, thanks, Wachek, for the question. In my view, I think it's more of the maturity in terms of size, diversity, and number of players. That will be the primary consideration on how
Thank
one
you,
can
Kolissa.
consider
Namrata has a question.
Market-based mechanism.
Can you please elaborate more on how South Africa is
mechanism is
strategizing on
domestic in
options
nature.
for the stranded
However,
assets?
at any stage, I am of the view that all countries should be participating in the international mechanisms, because the transaction costs are much lower than they are for domestic economies.
Yes, Mandy, we can hear you now.
All right, great. So just to answer Namrata's question around how we are strategizing. So what we are doing is we're in this discussion on the whole just transition with a number of players, and we're looking at options in terms of how to repurpose or reuse sites. And I'm speaking from the electricity sector, of course. There are other sectors that would also have to look at this. But in terms of the electricity sector, we're looking at what are the options for repurposing. We're looking at studies that have been done in other countries. But to be honest, it is also an open question for us, and we're looking at doing some deep dive studies into what it actually means in terms of repurposing. So can we just repurpose existing coal plants into renewables plants? Can we look at other sort of industry? Can we put a motor manufacturing plant where we used to have a coal plant? Can we do different types of things like training, using our sites for training of how to operate turbines, how to operate boilers and that kinds of things. So we're working on the plan. It's not there yet, but we're looking at these various options, and we're looking to back this up now with some deep studies. 'Into what the repurposing options are for us.
'Thank you, Kolissa.
'All right, great. So just to answer Namrata's question around how we are strategizing. So what we are doing is we're in this discussion on the whole just transition with a number of players, and we're looking at options in terms of how to repurpose sites. So what we are doing is we're looking at different options in terms of how to repurpose existing coal plants into renewables plants. Can we just repurpose existing coal plants into renewables plants? Can we look at other sort of industry? Can we put a motor manufacturing plant where we used to have a coal plant? Can we do different types of things like training, using our sites for training of how to operate turbines, how to operate boilers and that kinds of things. So we're working on the plan. It's not there yet, but we're looking at these various options, and we're looking to back this up now with some deep studies into what the repurposing options are for us.
Great, thank you, Mandy. There is a question, and I guess that Kolissa and Mandy, you both may step in to answer. What is the best mechanism for carbon pricing in Africa, asked by Alexander?
I can take a first step, Kolissa. So in terms of, it's a broad question. There's 54 countries in Africa. So it is very, very different approaches for different countries. So I think Kolissa outlined very clearly what the different economies are and contexts are for some of the countries. For South Africa, for example, because we have an energy sector that's very dominated by just two players, there's not much liquidity in the market. So carbon tax was what we selected as the best instrument for now, but that's not excluding potential domestic trading and that kind of thing. Whereas in Africa, in West Africa, the West Africans are looking at setting up a carbon market trading scheme in the energy sector because it is fairly new and they can include other sectors later. East Africa is also looking at that perspective in terms of there are more renewables plants being built in Kenya, so they are looking at things like a feed-in tariff. They are looking at the possibility of using Article 6. So, it's various instruments depending on the economies.
Kolissa?
Okay, just to add on and maybe respond to the next question of why would one choose a market-based approach. Just to add on to what Mandy said, I think it's important to note that in a lot of African countries, installed capacity primarily for electricity is quite low. So the main issue that in Africa we're dealing with is not reduction in emissions, but it's avoiding emissions by investing in renewable energy technologies. So incentives such as embedded in your power purchase agreements become quite useful tools in order to ensure that renewable energy options are quite competitive for supplying the required energy within the domestic economies. And in terms of why one would choose a market-based approach, because some of the examples that we have seen in the EU ETS is that they have not been very fast in reducing emissions. I think there's always pros and cons of regulatory-based pricing vis-a-vis a market approach, all right? Because they've got different characteristics in terms of their ability to attract the least cost options of reducing emissions. The market is considered to be generally more efficient and effective in terms of least cost options than it is for regulatory pricing mechanisms. And another challenge with the regulatory pricing mechanisms is that there's a lot of subjectivity in how they are set. I think I indicated that as much as it is advisable to use the social cost of carbon as a proxy of how to set your regulated price for CO2, it may not necessarily translate to the outcomes that you are looking for. Whereas if you look at the market mechanisms,
great. Thank you, Kolissa.
They deliver primarily
from here, we will be able to take another 3 more questions as we are running short on time. So the next question, and I open it both to Kolissa and Mandy, very relevant question: how to obtain social support for carbon
has got
markets?
nothing to do with the design of the pricing mechanism itself.
Okay, so in terms of social support, I think what we've been placing a lot of emphasis and attention on is awareness and capacity building around what we mean by carbon markets. When we started talking about carbon markets in South Africa, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because it was seen negatively, it was based mainly around the carbon tax. So people had equated carbon pricing to carbon tax. And so we had to have, and businesses and industry were not very keen on a carbon tax when we started this 10 years ago. So, of course, over time, the discussion has changed and people have seen the importance of carbon pricing. So in terms of socializing it further, what we're trying to do in terms of the awareness raising and capacity building amongst different stakeholders, but starting mainly with business and industries, to say, how can carbon pricing bring down the cost of what we're trying to do? So, for example, we've had, and one of the other questions was, do we have examples of green financing in South Africa? We've had a very good renewable energy feed-in tariff, which has stimulated growth in the renewables industry in the country. And what we're socializing people around that is how that kind of instrument can bring down the cost of renewables. There are other social issues related to it, where people feel that with bringing in more renewables, we might be losing jobs in the coal industry. That ties into the other discussion we were having around just transition and making sure we don't erode development. But it's mainly around the capacity building, the awareness, but showing real examples of how carbon pricing, carbon markets can bring down the cost of emissions reductions, and then tying that back to the discussion on we actually have to do emissions reductions. It's coming globally, and we can't move away from that. So it's not an easy discussion. It's not an easy road, and it's by no means a complete discussion. But that's how we sort of framing it at the moment.
Thank you, Mandy, for sharing those very interesting examples. Kalisa?
I guess I fully agree with the points that Mandy raised with regards to how one gets social buy-in on that. I mean, it's a process. There's a lack of understanding. There'll always be pushback, and there's a lot of assurances that need to be provided along the way. I think the further question is, I mean, the incentives that countries would have in order to adopt carbon pricing instruments. I think we are at a very opportune time in history of climate action, in the sense that there's significant political momentum. I think what the UN Secretary General did a few months ago, or a month ago for that matter, is one expression of such. And the second aspect is we are in a global economy that is very slow in terms of growth, and there's a need of investment for economies, in economies. So renewable energy investments provide a conduit through things like your incentives, like as Mandy indicated.
Great, thank you, Kalisa. I second that completely. We are indeed at a very opportune time where, with the political will, the socio-economic development that comes together with it definitely makes it a little easier, but definitely a long road to go ahead. I would say the second last question is from Meredith. This one is aimed to Kalisa, that she says that you mentioned you need the will of the countries as a starting point. What incentive is there for countries to buy into carbon pricing? Thank you. And the last one from Juvarte. Do you know to what extent internal carbon pricing is applied in Africa, either by the governments or private sector?
Like the one that I just mentioned, to drive
I can speak for South Africa, so I'm not sure about other African countries, but there's a number of companies in South Africa that apply internal carbon price or shadow pricing in investment decisions. So to give, it started many years ago because we knew the carbon tax was coming. So to give a view on what that is going to cost, there was a lot of internal carbon pricing, shadow pricing, internalizing this cost of carbon in many company strategies going forward, especially since we're such carbon intensive companies. But of course, in our national treasury, there was a lot of discussion around how do you internalize this externality and come up with the carbon tax. So from a South African perspective, it is something that we have been looking into. And I think companies are looking to further that, because it's not just the carbon tax, but what happens globally. So carbon tax is national, but what happens globally in terms of the products that we export and import, and how will that impact us as well. So there has been something that we've been giving some thought to.
Great. With this, we do come to a wrap of this session of the webinar. Many thanks to our speakers, Mandy and Kalisa. and to all participants who have kept the session very engaging with your questions. In case you have any questions, concerns, please feel free to reach us at cplcsecretariat@worldbank.org. And for more details or to know more about the coalition, do visit us at www.carbonpricingleadership.org. Very soon, as the session wraps up, we would be sharing with you the session recording with presentation materials. Till then, thank you so much all for joining us.